Good morning and happy Passover, everyone. I want to get started, and it's been a while since we met, but we're wrapping up this is sort of the sequel to the anti-Semitism talks from last year, because we've been going through chapters from Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, and that's a week from tomorrow night when she is speaking at Westside Presbyterian Church, primarily on the chapter on Varian Fry. And if you remember, we were here last time, we talked about the Julie Oranger book, the Flight Portfolio, which is now a Netflix series. And they should give me royalties for saying that, but they're not going to. But it was released just Friday. I haven't seen it yet, but the timing is really, works nicely to focus on Varian Fry now. It's called Transatlantic. So if you look it was reviewed in the Times last week. If you just go Transatlantic, it's based on Julie Oranger's book. So, which is the historical fiction account that we spoke about here of Varian Fry. But it's, so I haven't seen it. I only read the review, but I know it's out and I'm anxious to watch it. But I've been kind of busy with Passover and stuff. Yes? It's the same director, right, who did Unorthodox and one other thing she did. Yes. She's German, right. No, but this is dramatic, so it should be good. So we have one more talk, which is next week at this time. The next week's talk is Jewish tourism, which Dara Horn critiques also in the sort of the dark side of that. Not tourism Jewish, but Jewish tourism of sites of destruction. So that'll be the topic for next Sunday, and then again Monday night is the talk with Dara Horn, and. We titled the talk "The Banality of Goodness" because she's making a play off the banality of evil, which was Hannah Arendt's book on the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which we mentioned here. And I can't believe I've never read that. I'm reading it now, and it's an extraordinary book. But this is about the flip side of it, the banality of goodness, that Varian Fry is not a righteous sage, but yet was a very righteous person, and how goodness can be you can be a very normal, not an extraordinary person and do extraordinary things. And that's the talk, at least she'll, reflecting on that we'll be doing next week. And very special to do it at Westside Presbyterian Church, which is on Varian Fry Way, just named in his memory. Today, we're going to talk about Merchant of Venice. So I'm going to go through, if you didn't read, did you all read her chapter on Merchant of Venice? All right, how many people here have know the play, Merchant of Venice? About half. Okay, a little more than half. Excellent. So, I'll talk about the basic story of the play. Her chapter on it is extremely powerful. And not only is it so powerful and so well written, she also gets, without footnoting it, it kind of hits the major issues that the critics in secondary literature in dealing with the alleged, and we'll talk about that, the anti-Semitism in the play and how they read the play. She carefully takes issues and summarizes in her very, very brief chapter, which she writes by means of a discussion with her 10-year-old son, which is almost like a play within a play then, because it's set up like a play as a dialogue that gets into the deep issues of the anti-Semitism in The Merchant of Venice. So there's multiple stories in The Merchant of Venice. The part that's of concern to us, right, is the treatment of Shylock, who is the rich Jew in Venice, and that he's not the merchant. The merchant of Venice is Antonio, who has to borrow money from Shylock because he's waiting for his ships to come in and they're lost at sea, and he wants to lend money to his friend Bassanio, who wants to woo Portia in Belmont at the other side of Italy. So that's the basic plot. So he borrows the money from Shylock, and what does he mortgage? He mortgages a pound of flesh. And he says, okay, no problem, my ships are going to come. That's easy. Thank you for your generosity. Although, of course, Shylock's not being that generous. And then the ships don't come in, and Shylock calls the note, and then brings Antonio to court, and they appear before the Duke of Venice, where then he wants to collect his pound of flesh. And at the time, then, Bassanio has successfully wooed Portia, and she gives him, because he doesn't have any money of his own, she gives him 10 times the amount of the initial loan. So go back to Venice and save your friend. And they go there, and they're offering 2 times, 3 times the amount of the loan. But Shylock says, no, I want my vengeance, because he wants vengeance on, and it's why does he want vengeance? This is vengeance on Christianity in general, and specifically on Antonio, because Antonio, the merchant of Venice, was always kind of cruel to Shylock and would spit at him, but also because Antonio hurt Shylock's business, because he's such a nice Christian, he would give money to people, like, without charging them interest, or very, very low interest. So that made Shylock's money lending business difficult, because then Shylock he couldn't charge high interest if Antonio is giving loans out for free. So that was so there, for all of these reasons, he wants to take his revenge there, and then there's in the scene at the end of Act 4, sort of a showdown between the strict line of justice and then the mercy, which is seen as a Christian quality, which Shylock does not have. And the Duke is begging Shylock, just be merciful. You don't really mean to, cut out a part of his chest, and would kill him, obviously. And Shylock says, no, I demand it. And then the play is resolved then, because Portia goes and disguises herself as a lawyer, and basically says, yes, no, you're absolutely entitled to it, but the note says a pound of flesh. It doesn't say any blood. So you have to cut out exactly a pound, but no blood with it. And if you cut out any blood, then you're conspiring to murder a Christian, and then you get killed, and then you get executed. So he says, then Shylock says, okay, fine, then I'll accept the 3 times the money offer. And she says, no, and then the Duke says, no, you can't. He says, okay, I'll just take the principal back. And they said, no, because you're conspiring to potentially kill, you also forfeit your whole fortune and half of it, and he loses all his money, and the Duke just lets him live. And the other part of the story is that Antonio takes his money, holds it in trust, and gives it to his daughter and son-in-law, because his daughter Jessica has married a Christian who he disinherited, Shylock disinherited, because he disapproves of the intermarriage. And then they say, so now it forces him to turn his estate over to his daughter so that she gets the money back. And then they say, and you have to convert to Christianity. And then he comes defeated. He says, okay. And then you think the play's over, but then there's another whole act where Portia was in disguise, and she convinces Bassanio to give her the ring that he promised to never take off, his wedding ring, and the same thing with her maid to his other friend. And then they do this whole thing where he says, you stole the ring, how you gave my ring away, you don't love me, you're not fair to me. And then it actually was her that he gave it to, he just didn't know he gave it to her. Somehow that makes it okay. And everyone lives happily ever after except Shylock. So that's the basic summary of The Merchant of Venice. The problem with The Merchant of Venice, right? It's like old Shakespeare. It's a comedy that there's disguise. The women are disguised as men, and their husbands think they don't realize it's their own wives. So there's that fun part of it. There's the morality tale. It kind of works out. Things work out in the end. But there is the image of the Shylock who is a sinister, evil, unbending Jew, right? And when and that is a character that is very, very disturbing, very, very disturbing, very troublesome. So there's this. All of Shakespeare's plays are always based on different sources, and there's like 200 years before him, the story of the rings that they were the wrong people, and the story and the story of there's the also story of Portia, that there's 3 boxes, one gold, one silver, one wooden, and only one of them has her portrait. And then the different suitors come. Bassanio is the one who gets to marry her because he picks the wooden box and her portrait is in it. And 2 other princes, one picks the gold, one picks the silver. Yeah, it's kind of an obvious story. You think it's going to be in the gold, but really it's in the wooden box. These are old stories, and they're from specific sources. And I'm reading here in this is the standard edition, the Yale Shakespeare edition. The introduction gives you the sources, and he explains where everything's from. He says, the Jew story, however, was a common one in all European literatures. Right? So the idea of the evil Jew who just wants his money, even when his daughter marries a Christian man, Jessica marries Lorenzo, and Shylock is all upset. He's not even upset that that his daughter's lost the faith. He's upset that now, I've lost all my money, and he goes on and on about the lost money, and there's a vengefulness and a connivingness that makes him, from a Jewish perspective, obviously very disturbing figure in literature. So I want to start with, and I'll go through some of the sections. I want to take you through some of the points that Dara Horn brings up in this wonderful chapter, and then highlight some of the issues that she addresses there. So it was chapter 11. It's actually one of the shortest, but I thought brilliant in the way that she writes it here. So this play takes place in 3 settings: in Renaissance Venice, in Elizabethan England, and in 21st century New Jersey, in a minivan that smells like gummy bears. I'll begin with the most important setting, the one with the gummy bears, because that is the only one that includes a person I love. The chapter is called Commuting with Shylock. The person I love is my 10-year-old son, though he is not always an easy person to love. Insistent, demanding, obsessive, morbid, and often too smart to be pleasant. He needs to get his way, and for a few recent months I was trapped in the car with him during a daily commute, 40 minutes in each direction. We survived by listening to podcasts, which I was downloaded by the gigabyte. Fortunately for me, he was fascinated by Radiolab. Fortunately, that is, until the host's banter during an episode about organ ownership devolved into a tangent about a certain famous play involving a certain famous character who insists and demands obsessively and morbidly on receiving default payment on a loan in the form of a pound of flesh. My son was riveted. We need, he informed me, to download that play. I felt slightly ill, both at the prospect of The Merchant of Venice, which I had not read in 25 years, and at the prospect of yet another showdown with my son. It's Shakespeare, I tried to deflect. The language is really hard. I don't think you'll understand it. Besides, I gulped, The Merchant of Venice is... Wait, it's Shakespeare? He had heard of Shakespeare. He was aware that Shakespeare was important. If it's Shakespeare, then we totally have to do it. You can always pause it and explain stuff. I tried to deflect again. If we're going to read Shakespeare, there are better plays. Macbeth, Hamlet. This one is... And her son says, this one is about a pound of flesh. I want a pound of flesh. Okay. I don't believe this is the exact word for word, or if this conversation with her son ever happened. But she makes the play with her son. It's an extraordinary dialogue. If you haven't read it, you got to read this. So he would have his pound of flesh, her son, who's her Jew, right? He would have his pound of flesh. And he's unrelenting, her son, right? He's unbending, like Shylock. So what happened next is shameful, and the shame is my own. Late that evening, after my children went to sleep, I tooled around online and found a well-received BBC radio production of The Merchant of Venice. Before downloading, I hesitated. I remembered the visceral feeling of physical nausea I had while reading that play as a student long ago. And I remembered believing the various teachers and professors who assured me and my peers that the play wasn't anti-Semitic, of course, just a product of its time. And the proof was that it was way better than Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, where the title character expresses his fondness for poisoning wells. After all, didn't Shakespeare make Shylock into a fully realized human? What with his oft-cited eyes, hands, organs, and dimensions? He had eyes, hands, organs, dimensions. If you pricked him, did he not bleed? What greater reassurance did anyone require? In school, I accepted this. Who was I, a teenage girl, to say that Shakespeare was wrong? Unlike teenage girls, who are apparently often mistaken about things like art and sexual assault, Shakespeare was not the sort of person who was wrong. Okay, there she gets really harsh there. And what she's saying, she's a PhD in literature, right? So obviously she studied at school, she studied it in college, and these were what her professors say. And she actually goes on to say elsewhere, she explains how there were few, that she goes on most professors, most scholars are apologetic for Shakespeare because it's Shakespeare. Shakespeare can't be an anti-Semite. It's like the most, understands the human condition more than anyone else in the world. So, and she says there are a few outliers in this discussion, like the Yale professor Harold Bloom, who saw it was completely anti-Semitic, but then people discount him, oh, he's Jewish. Okay, this is Harold Bloom's book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, where it's like a guide, he has a chapter on every Shakespeare play. I want to read you how he opens up the chapter on The Merchant of Venice. One would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to recognize that Shakespeare's grand equivocal comedy, The Merchant of Venice, is nevertheless a profoundly anti-Semitic work. You'd have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to see that, right? So he's railing against every other Shakespeare critic that came before him that does their utmost, makes cartwheels in order, gets themselves in knots to trying to apologize for Shakespeare. And the interesting point that Harold Bloom makes, and Merchant of Venice is performed. It's not taught so much in high schools, I don't think, anymore, right? So I was talking to my mom, was a high school English teacher, and she retired, and they used to teach it. She told me it's not taught anymore, but it's just too hard, taught the anti-Semitism. But it is produced all the time. And it was like a year or two ago. It was at the Shakespeare Festival in the Berkshires in the summer, and I mean it's always brilliant. I've never gone to see it. Like I would have to be really real masochist to want to go see the Merchant of Venice. But why is it performed all the time? The reason why it's performed all the time is because Shakespeare actors find it challenging to perform Shylock. Right? Even though he's not really the major character in the play, he doesn't have a lot of lines, but that's the big role. And the reason why they perform it is because it's a way of showing, it's challenging to act. Because don't act it like a greedy, evil Jew. Try to read the lines in a way that it shows that he's actually human, to find the irony that really you have to see the human underneath the facade of the evil, unforgiving, vengeful Jew. And to be able to do the line, that's challenging for an actor to play the surface role, like the evil role, but have the good human behind that. So that complexity is if you're a Shakespearean actor, you want to do that. And I think that's the reason why it's performed so much. Harold Bloom criticizes that. He says, and I'll read what he says, I am afraid that we tend to make The Merchant of Venice incoherent by portraying Shylock as being largely sympathetic. He says that destroys the text when you present Shylock as sympathetic, because that's not what Shakespeare wrote. And he says that even though it's always performed that way, and the only examples were the way it was performed in Germany and Austria in the period of the Third Reich. Then they had no problem there portraying Shylock as, they put on an extra long nose and do everything they can to show Shylock as evil. And that's important, right? And that's so, and I'll read another passage from Harold Bloom. He says, had Hitler won the Second World War and gone on to add 10 million more Jews to his achievement of 6 million Jewish corpses, then Shylock would have ceased to reverberate, but his unhappy persistence will extend as long as the history of the Jews, in which he has played an inglorious part, hardly one that Shakespeare ever could have contemplated. He says, it's a product of his time, did Shakespeare want to contribute to genocide? Of course not. Would history have been better if Shakespeare had never written The Merchant of Venice? Absolutely. Absolutely, he said, because of the role, and this is what Harold Bloom is saying, because of the role that Shakespeare holds in the canon of Western literature by portraying a Jew as evil and unforgiving and unmerciful, that did more damage than anything else in terms of setting up the prejudicial stereotype of who a Jew is. When you read the play, more often in the stage directions, very often it doesn't say Shylock, it just says the Jew, enter the Jew. So Shylock is the quintessential Jew. And it's not like Shakespeare did that by accident. They're not written by Shakespeare. Okay, so how old did they, how far did they go back? 7 years after his death. All right, that's still pretty Elizabethan though. Yeah. But it shows the way it was read. shortly out, right, if it's 7-8 years after, then it's, that's how it was understood in his time, which is probably the point that Harold Bloom is trying to make, right, that it was not, so I wonder, here, so there is a line, of course, when Shylock says, sufferance is the badge of all our tribe, so he says, yes, we suffer, but that's not necessarily sympathetic, right? It's just saying we suffer. Jews, that's their position, that they suffer, and we talked about that a lot last year. But then he puts in the voice of the clown, Lancelot, there's the phrase, certainly the Jew is the very devil incarnation. And he says the Jew, right? And that's in the text. That's not the stage direction. It doesn't say Shylock is the devil incarnation. He says the Jew is the devil incarnation. So the intent, right, and the way that that's read by people watching it, you don't have to make the contortions to think, oh, he's really presenting Shylock as different. Now, doesn't mean that as literature, right, a play can take on its own life and its meaning can change. Maybe, but in this case, there's a lot for it to overcome. Jackie.
So it's written to us. How can scholars say this is not an anti-Semitic? It's the feelings at the time, but the time and all times have been quite anti-Semitic.
Right. So I'm going to repeat the question for those watching on the live stream. You're saying, how can scholars claim it's not anti-Semitic when it so clearly is? Because if you're a scholar of Shakespeare, you're biased. You're biased in favor of Shakespeare. Right? It's the same thing, and that's natural, right? So it's the same when you're a scholar of something. You're not going to become a scholar of Shakespeare if you hate Shakespeare. You're going to come and say to Shakespeare if you love Shakespeare. And then if you love Shakespeare, the default position is to try to explain it. Plus, that was the polite thing to do. So I want to read you also, this is the Yale Shakespeare, which is sort of one of the standard English versions. It was published in the 19-teens and 1920s. It was 100 years old. And this is like a one volume that Barnes & Noble put together, so you have it all in one thing. My parents have a nice whole set that each one, which is, and when did Barnes & Noble do this? 1993. So it's like that's long stay. So I want to read you from the introduction to Merchant of Venice. And this was written in 1922, right? So this is, to this day, this is sort of one of the standard editions. But again, this is pre-Holocaust, 1922. What does the introduction say? Shylock is a man as well as a Jew. And while Shakespeare took the national attitude toward the Jews, it's a very polite way of saying anti-Semites, right? As Shakespeare took the national attitude toward Jews and wished his readers and the spectators to rejoice in Shylock's discomfiture, he allowed Shylock to state his own case fairly, and in his comparison of himself with Christians to reveal his human feelings. It is absurd to suppose that Shakespeare intended Shylock to be a hero or to carry the sympathy of the audience. On the other hand, Shakespeare was not writing anti-Semitic propaganda, but a play for the theater in which the interest is immensely heightened by making every character a recognizable human being. That's a polite anti-Semitism, is how I would define that, right? Yes, he follows the national attitude. He's prejudiced against Jews, but his purpose is not to spread anti-Semitism. His purpose is just to put on a comedy of which you have this evil Jew who's also a human, because his characters are not plastic. His characters are complex because it's Shakespeare. So you have a little sympathy for the bad guy. But it doesn't mean Shakespeare is an anti-Semite. And that's how most people read. This is the standard commentary, standard introduction, and that's how most read it. Mark? The Jewish community is okay, so I want to go there. So we're going to go there. So, You couldn't be. Correct, yeah, so I want to go there. There weren't, because the Jews were exiled in 1290. They don't come back until Oliver Cromwell. So there's no Jews there. So, but I want to talk about, because that's an important issue in some of the contemporary scholarship. But the first thing, we'll finish with that. We'll go back to that. So let's go to that now. It's a good point, right? So there is when was this book published? 1996. James Shapiro, Columbia University scholar, called Shakespeare and the Jews. You know, there's a whole book about Shakespeare and the Jews, but it's really Shakespeare. There were no Jews around Shakespeare, right? So what he does, though, is he said there are some Jews, but the Jews that there are conversos, and and they are and the Egyptians, the English. It's Passover. I know. The English, of course, they knew about Jews, but he goes to great pains in this book. He painstakingly paints a historical context of the images in the Merchant of Venice and how they were informed by what the Elizabethans knew and what Shakespeare would have known about Jews. So he has a whole section on ritual murder and the idea, pound of flesh. Well, because the Jews actually do want to take Christian flesh, and because they bake matzah from it, and that's the blood libel, which we talked about in last year's. And he reads that and their understanding of the blood libel and their understanding of circumcision and their prejudice about Jews, and he reads that into that sort of behind the play, and he reads into it also the idea of forced conversions and the Protestant ideal of bringing the Jews and converting them to Christianity. And that's why it's so important, he argues at the end of the play, that at the end of the trial in Act 4, that Shylock is forced also to convert and to accept Christianity. So he paints a whole contextual picture of there were no actual Jews. There was one allegedly a converso Jew who was a doctor, a physician of Queen Elizabeth, who was then accused of treason and was killed and was quartered up and very unmercifully executed. So Shakespeare was a part of the Elizabethan court, so he would have known that. So it's like taking the pound of flesh from the Jew, and then it gets reversed in the way that the blood libel is such a reverse of prejudice also. So he paints that whole picture of what they knew about Jews and what they understood. The book that we were based most of last year's course on, which is by the University of Chicago scholar David Nierenberg, called Anti-Judaism. Some of you are reading this. It's very thick, very overly intellectual style, but his chapter on the Merchant of Venice is a wonderful, wonderful chapter, and it's you kind of have to have the play fresh in your mind because he's quoting all over it, all over the play, and he uses the play as his explanation of the role of the construct of the Jew as the other as it develops in Western tradition. It's the main thesis of his book, called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, that anti-Semitism is not really a reaction to real Jews, but it's a sense of Christianity and then Western humanism understanding itself by defining what the other is and reflecting itself back from that. He completely takes issue with James Shapiro's whole project of trying to find an historical basis for the prejudices and the understanding that Shakespeare conveys. And I'll read you this section that Nierenberg writes. He says, I hope to convince you that so many imagined Jews on the new commercial stage of London, a city that had sheltered fewer real Jews in its long history than perhaps any other major one in Europe. Right? London knew the least about Jews than any other European city, and especially this period, right, Elizabethan period. And is the power of this critique that animated Shakespeare's Jewish questions in The Merchant of Venice. So Shakespeare scholars will recognize here an illicit challenge to the venerable school of criticism founded by Sidney Lee and Lucian Wolfe and re-energized by James Shapiro. That's this book, Shakespeare and the Jews, that emphasizes the importance of excavating real Jews as the context for The Merchant of Venice, right? That's Shapiro's argument, that the context is the blood libel, Jewish mercantilism, and all of that. And he says such excavators are misguided. He calls them an excavator, not even a literary critic, James Shapiro. James Shapiro he's a professor of English comparative literature at Columbia University, but Nierenberg says he's an excavator. Because he's not looking at the literature, he's looking at history. And such excavators are misguided, not only because their confidence in the Judaism of the few dozen descendants of Spanish and Portuguese converts they discover living in Shakespeare's London. Okay, there's a few dozen that are descended from Jews, that are conversos, none of whom confess, by the way, to being anything but Christian, replicates the genealogical convictions of the Inquisition. More important, their insistence that Christian anxieties about Judaism depend on the existence of real Jews ignores the ability of Christian thought to generate Judaism out of its own entrails. Even if we were to find an entire clan of the Hebrews cowering in some Elizabethan estaminet, we would be no closer to understanding the work done by figures of Judaism on Shakespeare's stage. For that, we need to focus on the critical work done by Judaism within Shakespeare's Christian culture and that of his contemporaries. And then it's the argument that he carries through in this book that has nothing to do with real Jews. It has to do with the otherness, right? So you have this challenge between law and mercy. Mercy is considered a Christian attribute, so then you need to otherness by having Shylock who insists on the letter of the law. And that contrast is set by Paul in the New Testament. And it's carried through all the way, that the Christian ideal is mercy and not following the letter of the law. So you need someone to represent the other side, which the Jew does, which has no mercy. So when they go and they plead Shylock and they say, we'll even give you more money, it's not even about money. It's just he can't get past the letter of the law and he wants his vengeance. Right, so that it's just a construct. It's because of how the Christians understand themselves. It's not even have to do with real Jews that are there. Question.
Question and a comment. So can you enjoy Shakespeare knowing he has this great big voice about something so important? That's my question. My comment is also, I keep thinking of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. What that came from in early 1900s, where that came from, and the impact it had on larger society, and the people who defended Birth of a Nation by saying D.W. Griffith was this incredible filmmaker, this was a historic movie, etc. And for how many years? I would say it's only very recently that people say it's completely racist. It's completely
Right.
revisionist history. It makes no sense at all. People, and yet it sounds like, based on Dara book and your lecture, that people should have the same reaction to Merchant of Venice that they do to Birth of a Nation.
Right, so the question is, just repeating, how do you enjoy Shakespeare, knowing this, and comparing it to Birth of a Nation, right, a movie that we see as so anti-Semitic, that film. Racist, yes, right, thank you. You can't enjoy a film like that, and you can't enjoy a film like Merchant of Venice. But you don't always have to, it doesn't mean it's not good literature, but it doesn't have to be, but all literature is not nice. Right? It's just, it is incredibly prejudicial and anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean it's not worth reading, right? So, and actually, the conclusion, let me read you the conclusion from James Shapiro, and then we can finish with him. And Harold Bloom quotes his conclusion. He says, from its very first stagings in the 1590s, So I've tried to show that much of the play's vitality can be attributed to the ways in which it scrapes against the bedrock of beliefs about the racial, national, sexual, and religious differences of others. I can think of no other literary work that does so as unrelentingly and as honestly. To avert our gaze from what the play reveals about the relationship between cultural myths and people's identities will not make irrational and exclusionary attitudes disappear. Indeed, these darker impulses remain so elusive, so hard to identify in the normal course of things that only in instances like productions of this play do we get to glimpse these cultural fault lines. This is why censoring the play is always more dangerous than staging it. The merchant's capacity to illuminate a culture is invariably compromised when those staging it flinch from presenting the play in its complex entirety. which is what occurred when Nazi directors, in the 50 or so productions they staged between 1933 and 1945, it was their favorite Shakespeare play, right, omitted the intermarriage of Jessica and Lorenzo. That the Nazis were very uncomfortable with. A Christian could marry a Jew, and which also occurred when the British director Barry Kyle, in a 1980 production in Israel, was persuaded to omit Shylock's acceptance of conversion to Christianity since it was so disturbing for Jewish audiences. So they took that out in Israel. And then, he goes on to say, as long as anxieties about racial, national, sexual, and religious difference continue to haunt the way we imagine ourselves and respond to others, Shakespeare's words will remain not of an age, but for all time. So he's saying, it's anti-Semitic, it's disturbing, but it doesn't mean that we throw it out. We can't ignore. You could say the same thing, passages in the Gospels, right? They're incredibly anti-Jewish passages in the Gospels. But it doesn't mean that Christians, but when we point that out to Christians or they point it out themselves, it doesn't mean they throw out the Bible. It just means they recognize it. There are parts in the Torah we don't like also. There are parts in the Hebrew Bible that are very disturbing. So part of it is just acknowledging that and accepting that. Let me go back to the historical point. So Dara Horn addresses that. She tells the story of this guy, Dr. Lopez, who was executed in Elizabethan times, and it was because, all right, so it also seems unlikely that Shakespeare was unaware of actual Jews in England, given that one of the biggest news stories in the years immediately preceding the play's composition was the public trial and execution at the Tower of London of a converted Portuguese Jew named Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, chief physician to Queen Elizabeth I, who was accused of being paid by the Spanish monarchy to poison the Queen. Dr. Lopez, one of the most respected physicians of the 16th century, had indiscreetly revealed that he once treated the Earl of Essex for venereal disease. The Earl took revenge by framing Dr. Lopez for treason and arranging for his torture. While on the rack, Dr. Lopez confessed, though like a Jew, as the court record states, he denied all charges at trial, while the attorney for the crown referred to him matter-of-factly as a perjuring, murdering traitor and Jewish doctor. And then he's executed and he's tortured, and she goes on, she talks about it, and then she says, and it is, of course, entirely unclear whether this trial and public humiliation of an allegedly greed-driven Jew attempting to murder an upstanding Christian, rapturously reported in the press with myriad anti-Semitic embellishments, sounds familiar, right? Because that's sort of like the trial of Shylock, had anything at all to do with Shakespeare's play about the trial and public humiliation of a greed-driven Jew attempting to murder an upstanding Christian, which Shakespeare composed shortly after Dr. Lopez decomposed. Most likely these things were completely unrelated. So she has it both ways, right? She gives you 2 pages giving you the historical context that James Shapiro is going in great detail, he gives to us. And she says, are they related? Yeah, probably not. So she sort of then agrees, right, with David Nirenberg. David Nirenberg and James Shapiro, they're not disagreeing. They both see the Merchant of Venice as extremely problematic and anti-Semitic. The question is this based on a historical context, or is it just based on a Christian prejudice that has nothing to do with actual real Jews that they knew? And she kind of fudges it, but by giving that, it's her acknowledgement of that conflict that is there in the scholarship and that is debated, in terms of how we understand it. I want to, because I want to leave some time for questions, so I want to focus on well, first let's talk about the conversion, and then the if we prick do we not bleed part. So conversion, there's debated among scholars how important that conversion that conversion element is, right? Because it's sort of stuck. Is it so critical because it makes it a Christian morality play? And then Harold Bloom argues no, because if that were the case, you see, and he converts to Christianity and he sees the religious truth, then there wouldn't be Act 5, which is very unreligious. The women are saying that, celebrating adultery, that, we're gonna lie with the men who you gave the ring to, even though it's them that they gave it to, so there is no, but it's just a comic farce at the end that kind of completely undoes if there's any theological Christian morality conclusion at the end of Act 4, which is, and Bloom's suggestion of then why Shylock converts, he just says, it's you have to do something with Shylock, because otherwise there's no way to explain why he's not in the story anymore in Act 5. So by saying he converts, he's just defeated, is what it means, right? He's defeated. And which also reflects, it's just an easy way to do it, and it also reflects a discussion earlier when there's a talk with his daughter Jessica. It's a phrase earlier, which is a great line, funny line in the play, when they said, her husband Lorenzo is concerned because she's talking with Lawrence about worried that he's converting, and she says, he doesn't accept me because I'm a Jew's daughter. And you are no good of a member of a commonwealth for converting. For in converting Jews to Christians, what do you accomplish? You raise the price of pork. If you convert Jews to Christians, then there's going to be more people eating pork, and then that's going to raise the price of pork, right? So, yes. Now, it's complex, right? Part of the argument, and all the scholars talk about this Marlowe play on the Jew that has a similar evil Jewish character who's poisoning the wells, and this is the context, and Shakespeare is toning it down because he makes the Jews more complex. He makes Shylock sympathetic. He doesn't make Shylock sympathetic. It's just that he's a better playwright than Marlowe, that Shakespeare's characters are more interesting, right? Which is going to bring us to the key passage that I want to talk about. But I'll take another question. Jackie.
It's probably not original thought, but the fact that Shakespeare has Shylock convert,
Right.
as opposed to kill him off, shows in essence also a Christian mercifulness amongst sort of gets him out of the play by just saying, he converted to Christianity, and that was what we wanted or what he should have.
But the Duke already pardoned him. He said, I'm not going to take your life. I'm going to show you the mercy that you don't have. So he didn't have to also convert. He could have just pardoned him, right? He didn't have to say, and convert. It's a total humility. Yeah. Which is, I think, but Harold, the way I think Harold Bloom argues convincingly, it's not because of the theological or the historical idea of converting Jews. It's just that it's a total humiliation. He loses everything. He loses his daughter, then he loses his money, he doesn't get his pound of flesh, and he has to convert to Christianity on top of that too. It's just a total humiliation, and that's the dramatic function that the conversion has. Not that, now the Jews see the way, right? Now the Jews see the way. And what Nierenberg will point out, the Jews can't see the way, because then it wouldn't be another, right? In order to have a sense of Christian mercy, you need to have a Jew who's not merciful. So that's the dialectic that you need, which is what he argues, which is why there doesn't need to be any historical context. Jews, evil, and it's...
Judaism's rejection of Jesus as the Messiah is a direct contradiction of the Christian faith.
Judaism's...
Any Jew that exists
Any Jew that just is a rejection of, they're in opposition to each other, exactly, the two religions. David, and then I'm going to get back, because I got to go.
These days, there's great controversy about slavery and whether George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or whatever was having slaves. So I'm just wondering, was this a sign of the times? Was Shakespeare just reflecting the sign of the times by having...
So the question is Shakespeare reflecting the sign of the times? Yeah, so that's why the Yale Shakespeare says he presents the national attitude toward the Jews. Right? I mean, it's the point is, and I think this is the dark side. Was Shakespeare a bloodthirsty anti-Semite? Was he a Nazi? No. Was he prejudiced against Jews? Yes. Can you forgive him because he didn't actually have any Jewish friends? I don't need to forgive him. I don't need to forgive him in order to read what he wrote. So I want to read how does Harold Bloom conclude his essay on Merchant? He says, I end by repeating, it would have been better for the last 4 centuries of the Jewish people had Shakespeare never written this play. Right? So shadowed and equivocal is the Merchant of Venice, though, I cannot be certain there is any way to perform it now and recover Shakespeare's own art of representing Shylock. There's just no way to perform it. He disagrees with James Shapiro. James Shapiro says censoring it is worse than not holding it. He says, no, there's no good way to perform this play. Should we study it in a college course? Of course. A synagogue adult ed course, yes. But we're not going to put it, even for the perm spiel, we're not going to do it. So the perm spiel director's in the back. So let me go. Okay, we'll see. Okay. So let's go to the key phrase. Let's go to the key passage. So that, what is the context here? Oh, and then I got to find his quotation on that too, which I will. The context of the famous line. So they're talking to Shylock, and he's saying, you're really going to take his flesh? And then Shylock says, to bait fish with all of it, feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. I want to start early because you got to see the context. The context is, I want my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? If you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. So that's the passage, right? So the key is, it's often quoted out of context. Right, it's quoted as you just start, if you prick us, will we not bleed? Like Shakespeare is trying to teach his audience that Jews are human beings. But if you look at the context, I'm a human too, I want my revenge. It's not a redeeming context. So I want to read you then now Harold Bloom's point, and then we'll go back to Dara Horn here. However problematic, The Merchant of Venice essentially is a romantic comedy, and pathos is alien to it, as alien as Shylock the Jew. I myself find little pathos in Shylock, and I'm not moved by his hath not a Jew litany, since what he is saying there is now of possible interest only to wavering skinheads and similar sociopaths, right? If you're a wavering skinhead, then, oh, the Jew is a human being, also bleeds. Oh, maybe I should, okay. Otherwise, what is it? Perhaps it was a revelation for Shakespeare's audience, but it had better not be such for any audience now. That's an extraordinary comment. It should not be a revelation that if you prick a Jew, he bleeds. Like, what good does it do? And this goes to how the play is performed. If you're performing it in an apologetic way for Shakespeare, right? So you want to show the irony, then I read it straight to you before, but you're going to say, here, I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same disease? Healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? Okay, that's the apologetic way. But what Bloom is arguing is that's not the context. The contextual reading is, I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, and senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tick us, do we tickle us? Do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? If you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Yeah, like that's the context, and that's what he's saying. Let's hold the questions. I just want to finish because I have some people that I want to finish what I was going to say, but let me finish. So just hold on, hold this thought. So that's Bloom's take on it. Now I want to tell you how does Dara Horn present this in conversation, in her dialogue, her play within a play with her son, and she makes the same point. She's influenced by Harold Bloom. She obviously read his essay there, which she acknowledges in the book. Okay, sorry. Yeah. What son says. So I'll just here. Okay. So it's terrible, he says, does it get better? And she says, oh, no, it gets better. So this she pauses it before that speech when they're listening to it. She says, this speech changes what you think of Shylock, I told my son. It makes him more human. My son put on his game face. Okay, let's hear it. The actor began the brief soliloquy that every English-speaking Jew is apparently meant to take as a compliment. I am a Jew, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? If you wrong us, shall we not revenge? So every English-speaking Jew is taken as a compliment is what Bloom says, right? Right? She's being sarcastic, right? That's a compliment that we bleed if you prick us. So then her son says, wait, that's the part where he's more human? I hit pause again. Sure, I told my son, game facing him back in the rear view. He's reminding us how he's like everyone else. He's a normal person with normal feelings. My son laughed. You seriously fell for that? I swallowed, sickened. What do you mean? And the son says, Shylock's just saying he wants revenge. Like, oh yeah? If I'm a regular human, then I get to be evil like a regular human. This is the evil monologue thing that every supervillain does. I've had a rough life, and if you were me, you would do the same thing. So that's why I'm going to kill Batman. Moo ha 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 ha. He's just manipulating the other guy even more. And then Dara Horn says, no, I fumbled remembering the monologue's final words, the villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. For the first time, I heard the unspoken phrase that followed it, Muhahaha. I'd be trolled, betrayed like Shylock at court. You're not supposed to fall for the evil supervillain monologue. What idiot would fall for that? Her son says to her. What idiot would? And then she writes, I would. I did. I stared at the road in shame. My son is insistent, demanding, obsessive, morbid, too smart to be pleasant. It had not previously occurred to me that those traits are also his greatest strengths, the sources of his integrity. That was pathetic, he muttered. It was unclear whether he was referring to the play or to his mother. Are there other parts where he actually acts normal, or is that it? And then she goes, they go up and she explains the other parts where scholars try to find the humanity in Shylock, and she sees how there's just not enough there and that he would see through that also. So then she writes, none of it worked. And then I saw just how deep that the gaslighting went. I felt obligated to make it work, to contort this revolting material into something that excused it. I have a doctorate in literature. I'm aware that Shakespeare's plays contain many layers and mean many things, but the degrading hideousness of this character is so obvious even to a 10-year-old. And no matter how many more layers the play contains, that is unambiguously one of them. Why, I wondered, should I feel obligated to excuse this blindingly obvious fact, like some abused wife explaining why her darling husband beat her up? Why did I need to participate in this perverse historical mind trick of justifying my own people's humiliation? A humiliation that was never just a cartoon, but that cost so many of my ancestors their dignity and even their lives. Right? This is not Batman. Nope, I told my son, that's it. That's it? That totally sucked. It gets worse, I said. How could I have exposed my child to this? Let's turn it off. But my son is insistent, demanding, obsessive, morbid. When you prick him, he does not bleed. I need to hear how it ends. And then the trial scene, he talks about the trial scene, and then at last it's over, all the humiliations upon humiliation of Shylock. And then 20 minutes of congratulatory hijinks followed Shylock's final exit, that's Act 5, as the cast reveled in their victory and his seized assets. At last it was over. The minivan fell silent. Then my son announced, "I never want to hear that again." And this is the best line in the book. She writes, "You will definitely hear that again," I said. And then, so meaning that it is I'll read you her last paragraph. "It's true, censorship is beside the point." So she's taking issue with James Shapiro here. The insane extremes of cancel culture, extravagantly irrelevant, because this double helix of hate and art is built into our world. My son will read this play in school, or he will hear about a new performance. It's one of the most performed plays Shakespeare ever wrote. He will encounter headlines and jokes using the phrase pound of flesh. He couldn't even make it through a season of Radiolab without it. There is a terrible bond at work here, tying us inexorably to a long history of ugly caricatures and spilled blood. And there is also a much subtler and more insidious bond, tying us to the need to justify and accept it. But unlike me, my son insists on integrity, demands it. He is not afraid to be unpleasant. He knows evil when he hears it. He is ready for this bond. I told him, "And now you know." "Yes," he said and smiled. "Next, can we download Dracula?" So the reason why she constructs this play of this dialogue with her son is because it's the device that she constructed in cutting through all the nonsense on trying to explain The Merchant of Venice. Just as a 10-year-old can see that he's a villain. He's the villain. And everything else that she learned in her doctoral seminars of trying to make it good doesn't make good what was not good, which is why Harold Bloom says it would have been better if Shakespeare had never wrote this play. Okay, there were comments. That's what I got for you today. So, question, Linda.
Is there any kind of basis for a pound of flesh?
Yeah, so if you want an historical basis of it, then James Shapiro will give it to you. You can read this book, and he says it's actual. The argument is made that it actually refers to circumcision. And he makes this whole argument that you don't know where the pound of flesh is supposed to come until the end, with the beginning of the trial, when he says it's at the breast, so you cut it right there at the heart, which is why there's no way to do it without getting blood. But then James Shapiro argues, but then you have to think about the circumcision of the heart versus the circumcision of the flesh. So he really means circumcision of the penis, not cutting of the flesh at the heart. But that's a lot of connections that James Shapiro is making. I really don't think that Shakespeare expected the audience to connect all those dots. If you look for something hard enough, you can find it. But I think, but that's the point that Dara Horn is making, as Harold Bloom, that it's not, and the point that Nirenberg is making, that you don't think too hard about it. It's just, there's an old story, and there was a basis for that story, and that's where, it's the idea of you're just a pound of flesh. It's like, it's farcical, and that's why it's in a comedy, Yes, David.
Yeah, thinking of his point
Crazy.
about D.W. Griffith. I mean, he did not do so many great things, and so it's an easy thing to let, that movie, just
Right.
drift into nothingness.
Right. Shakespeare did write a lot of good plays.
So many things
Yeah.
to
No, right, but that's,
Griffith was considered a pioneer in filmmaking. I mean, he was a god.
Well, he was.
right.
And his influence in the South after that movie, Woodrow Wilson gave him a private screening, was amazing.
Right, so Woodrow Wilson gave Woodrow Wilson gave the private screening to Birth of a Nation. Obviously, it was well acclaimed. It's one of the darkest spots on Woodrow Wilson's biography, which is why Princeton took his name off the school, But yes, so people are appreciating, but it's not, but I think to David's point, we're not comparing Griffith to Shakespeare, okay? Shakespeare's the greatest author, and yet he still did something that we're very unhappy about that would have been better if he didn't write. That even the greatest playwright and the greatest craftsman of the English language could still write something that it would have been better if it didn't write. And that's the nature of things, right? That's the tragedy of anti-Semitism, right? David Nirenberg says anti-Judaism is part of the Western tradition. It doesn't mean that there are wonderful, brilliant things in the Western tradition, but there's a dark side of it. You look at, that's why I mentioned the Bible. right? You wouldn't want there not to be a Bible, but there are parts in the Bible that would have been better if they hadn't been written. And then you look at national cultures. I mean, I did my doctorate in German history, right? There are a lot of things in German history that are extraordinary and have fantastic contributions to Western civilization. There's another part that we wish it wouldn't have happened, obviously. So everything is a mix. Like we don't live in a world of black and whites. And that's, I think, why we appreciate Shakespeare, because it's not quite black and white, but we still have to understand what we're looking at. Nadine. So the point is that there are a lot of great artists that are not great human beings. Now, right, and Shakespeare is probably the greatest playwright, and The Merchant of Venice is probably the greatest anti-Semitic play that was ever written. Put it that way, but it's still anti-Semitic. Lee. Right, we think American literature that paints black men negatively, right? We think about Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, right? Yeah. Mark Twain might have had it both ways.
Because, I mean, he seemed to have, maybe I don't know Mark Twain well enough, but he has that rap of potentially being a racist, but it seems like he had a larger vision.
Mark Twain potentially is a racist, but it seems like he had a larger vision. Yeah, I mean, again, we'd like to hope so. And that's when we read Shakespeare. He's being ironic. You're missing the irony. He's not really anti-Semitic. You're missing the irony. No, there is still a prejudice there. And of course, Mark Twain has a prejudice there.
Army is like so viciously anti-Catholic.
The Connecticut anti-Catholic. Yeah, no, you got prejudices there. And Mark Twain, yeah, I mean, people have prejudices. And that's why, like, you can understand it. But when you say, and that's why I pointed out that sentence from the Yale introduction when he says, Shakespeare took the national attitude toward the Jews. I mean, we don't need to apologize for things. Just call it what it is. And that's the point of her chapter with her 10-year-old son. Like, sometimes you just need to call it what it is, You can't just contextualize it out. It is a real prejudice, and again, because the argument among scholars, whether it's based on historical context, which is Shapiro, or based on dialectics, which is Nuremberg, I mean, ultimately it doesn't matter, right? It's still, the point is, we can't argue away the anti-Semitic nature of it, and we think of it. So this goes back to understanding anti-Semitism in America. It's the experience that Dara Horn describes, going to graduate school and earning a doctorate in literature where, you're being imbued with the fact, oh, no, it's irony. Oh, no, Shakespeare's not anti-Semitic. Oh, it's, and Harold Bloom rails against that, but goes against the grain of all other Shakespeare scholars that it's by default they want to apologize for Shakespeare. That's what we call a higher anti-Semitism, right? So when you're the Jew, that's why she compares it to the wife who's apologizing for her abusive husband. I mean, that's how dangerous it is. And that's why the way that we struggle, the only way to fight against that is to call it out and to recognize it. And that's what she's trying to do. So again, I hope to see you a week from tomorrow night so we can hear her in her own voice. It was nice seeing you this morning. We'll do the last talk a week from today at 11:30. Happy Passover.